Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the MedTech Impact Podcast, where you get to hear from leaders and innovators who are shaping the future of medical technology. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Meiklejohn.
And we're your hosts of the show.
So today on the MedTech Impact Podcast, we are delighted to be joined by Nicky Driscoll, CTO and co-founder of NeuroBionics. Nicky, welcome to the show.
Hi guys, thanks for having me on.
Well, Nicky, I think this is a long time coming because, we've been trying to catch one another. You've been on the road, you've been a busy person, and so delighted to finally get you on and hear all the great things that are happening in NeuroBionics. You were part of our latest cohort and Impact. You did amazingly well. You're now part of MedTech Innovator. So again, we're just super excited to have you on the show. But before we get into all the exciting stuff NeuroBionics is doing, let's set it for the audience. What is the big problem that NeuroBionics is looking to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. So the problem that we are looking to solve is access to a therapy called deep brain stimulation, or DBS. So this is a therapy that involves delivering electrical stimulation into deep brain regions. It's used a lot for movement disorders like essential tremor and Parkinson's disease, and now being explored much more widely for other conditions like depression, Alzheimer's, and even stroke rehabilitation. But really the big issue is that getting DBS today requires a very invasive open brain surgery that the patient is typically awake for. And this is such an invasive surgery that's so scary to patients, and there's a limited number of surgeons across the country that are really able to perform those surgeries. And at the end of the day, what that all adds up to is that today, about less than 1% of patients who might actually benefit from DBS actually end up getting it, despite the fact that this is a therapy that works tremendously well. And so the big problem that we're trying to solve is this access issue. How can we make this therapy accessible to many more patients so that they can reap the benefits of DBS without having to go through this really invasive surgery?
It just sounds invasive when you're talking about getting rods stuck inside your brain. What are the outcomes for the people who aren't taking it? What's the lasting results for them?
Yeah, so DBS is generally used to treat symptoms rather than, it's not really a curative therapy, but for example, in Parkinson's disease and tremor, DBS helps a lot with controlling tremor, weakness, and these motor symptoms. And so patients that don't get DBS are really just kind of left to live with their symptoms. And what that often means is a much degraded quality of life. Makes it a lot harder to just do your activities of daily living, feed yourself, get dressed in the morning. All of those things are so much harder when you have uncontrollable tremor. So DBS really helps to manage these symptoms and give people more quality of life. And without DBS, they're really just choosing to live with the symptoms.
And that's an incredibly low number. Only 1% are actually getting this procedure done right now.
Yeah, it really is. And there's like a lot of factors that go into that. Still, like our first line of defense for most neurological conditions is drugs. And so these conditions are typically managed with medication first. The problem is so many patients end up failing medications or finding that medications have waning efficacy over time. And so that tends to be when we turn to these more bioelectronic medicine approaches where we actually try to use stimulation or neuromodulation to treat these effects. However, we know that neuromodulation works really well. So if we could make it less invasive, we might make it more mainstream and allow more patients to get access to those therapies.
Yeah, and Kyle, I'd seen that, even that 1%, this is well over $1 billion market, even with that tiny number. So not only could there be amazingly improved outcomes, but also a significant market opportunity.
Yeah, well, what's really exciting too, Richard, is that, we've been hearing a lot over the last, I'd say 5 years, a lot of innovation around bioelectronic medicine. And, Nicky, I think you kind of hit on some really key points here, is that ultimately the technology just isn't there today to help support these cases and get patients the treatment that they need from a device standpoint for this deep brain stimulation. So tell us, a little bit more about NeuroBionics and the product and the technology that you guys are developing to help make these types of procedures more accessible and impactful to patients today.
Yeah, absolutely. And to circle back on what you said, bioelectronic medicine has shown tremendous promise, this idea of using stimulation of the nervous system to treat a lot of conditions. And one of the big challenges has been developing tech that allows us to deliver stimulation to different parts of the body, the brain, the peripheral nervous system. A lot of the devices available today are bulky, they use rigid materials, or they're just difficult to implant. And so specifically talking about deep brain stimulation, today it's kind of a rod of electrodes that gets inserted through a craniotomy, and then there's a wire that gets kind of threaded under the skin to an electronic unit that's implanted in the chest called an implantable pulse generator. So that's state of the art today for DBS. What we're developing at NeuroBionics is a device that allows us to stimulate deep brain regions, but do it through an endovascular surgical approach. So what that means is you get a very small incision, they thread a catheter up into your brain. This is the same way that we treat aneurysms today. Also, if we place stents in the brain, which is pretty commonly done. So it's a very common surgical approach. You navigate these little catheters up into the brain under real-time X-ray fluoroscopy image guidance, so you can actually see where it is at all times. And basically what we're developing at NeuroBionics is a very thin stimulation lead that we can thread through a catheter and deliver inside a blood vessel in the vein. And so how that works is essentially you navigate a catheter to the target in the brain, you deploy this very thin fiber through that device, it expands in the vein so that it anchors in place. And then there's electrodes on that device that will stimulate the brain tissue through the vessel wall. So at NeuroBionics, the complete device that we're developing is essentially this endovascular lead, which is delivered through a catheter, as I mentioned, and then that gets connected to a back-end electronic unit that has the battery and the electronics to actually deliver the stimulation pulses, and that's also implanted in the chest, much like a pacemaker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's I mean, remarkable technology, and it's just incredible to hear that really, you're leveraging again an already very common type of endovascular catheter approach, right, to the brain that many surgeons, neurosurgeons are already familiar with today. Richard and I, we were all chatting before this, but we thought, why can't this be done minimally invasive? And I think, that would be really good for the audience to kind of hear about the benefits of, your minimally invasive versus a non-invasive, I should say, the non-invasive approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were chatting a little bit before the show about non-invasive methods to stimulate the brain. And one that folks may know about is called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. So that involves using a system that actually delivers magnetic fields to the brain through the skull. And TMS also has a lot of promise. It's a non-invasive way to stimulate the brain, and getting less invasive, non-invasive is always better. One of the challenges with TMS, however, is it's very, very good at stimulating cortical brain structures, meaning like the surface of the brain. And when you need to stimulate very, very deep brain regions, more towards the center of the brain, the spatial resolution of TMS is not very good. And so for deep brain stimulation, or DBS, as the name implies, we need to get to these deep brain regions, but we also need to do it with high precision. So we have to be very targeted in the places that we're stimulating so we don't get side effects and off-target effects. And those deep brain regions are challenging to target with non-invasive methods like TMS. So, to summarize there, TMS really good for stimulating the cortex and kind of surface brain structures, but the type of therapy that we're looking to deliver really requires us to get into these deep brain regions.
Awesome. So I do want to go back to your product real quick here. Just because on the surface and on the website, you talk about this multifunctional, flexible bioelectronic fibers, right? Sounds like there's a lot going on there. And without obviously disclosing any proprietary features, I'm just really curious to kind of better understand, what all that means. And I'm sure our audience would like to know too, how you're doing it. So can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. Multifunctional bioelectronic fibers is definitely a mouthful.
Yeah.
Essentially, our core technology is we've pioneered a way to make hair-thin fiber devices into which we can incorporate different functionality. So The core one that we've been talking a lot about is we can incorporate electrodes and microwires into these thin fiber devices. We've also done a lot of additional things like including microfluidic channels so that you can deliver drugs very locally through this fiber. And we've also done some things with optical capabilities by incorporating like an optical fiber inside of that fiber. We are not doing that for our first product, which is focused on neuromodulation, but we have sort of ambitions to expand applications beyond that that might require localized drug delivery and so forth. But really the core of the tech is a kind of a unique manufacturing approach that allows us to make very thin, flexible devices that have a lot of functionality baked into them.
Well, you know, I think all of this is really incredible. And, you know, Richard, when you think about, you know, right now, a really kind of new market for Nicky and neurobionics technology, you know, and how maybe new this might be, you know, I think about like that learning curve, you know, while they're leveraging the endovascular approach, which is obviously pretty common today, it's still a fairly new technology. And you kind of think about obviously how a neurobionics is going to, you know, enter the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think as well, the fact that we've had on recently a couple of guests, Rapid Medical and XCAP, who are both honing in on the whole stroke challenges as well. It's just fascinating to have you come on and obviously look at, the therapeutic side of what you could do with the technology like this. I appreciate you are reasonably early on the product development roadmap. Can you maybe talk a little bit about, what's come before and where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're an academic spin out and we're a pretty new company. So we spun out of a lab at MIT about a year ago. And the core tech, which are those fibers I was talking about earlier, have been in development in our lab at MIT for about 10 years now. And in terms of what we've done with that tech so far in the academic lab before starting NeuroBionics, we did a whole host of neuroscience with them. So they were originally developed as a neuroscience tool. We did a lot of work in showing that we could learn a lot about circuits in the brain using these thin flexible devices as neural probes. So these were implanted directly into brain tissue. But we use them in animal models ranging from rodents all the way up to non-human primates for neuroscience studies. And so the core tech was kind of well developed and well established in these different animal models for research. And since starting NeuroBionics, we've been focusing on taking that technology and translating that to a medical device. The NeuroBionics, the decision to go in the direction of this endovascular device, our tech is really well suited to that because it's a thin, flexible fiber that kind of just fits the form factor of a catheter and anything that you would need to deliver endovascularly. That said, the work that came before NeuroBionics, we hadn't done anything endovascular with these fibers before. So in terms of our development roadmap, we're really focused right now on the safety and biocompatibility studies of taking this tech that was implanted directly into the brain a lot and now showing that we can safely put this into a blood vessel. So that's really what we're focusing on now.
Well, I have to say, I think anyone who's heard your presentation is always blown away by what you're doing and the potential for this. And I feel like even recently at MedTech Innovator, you got another prize while you were on the road. So big congrats for that. But
Thank you.
what's the feedback been like from, say, healthcare professionals? Because again, I imagine they must be pretty excited about this type of technology being put in their hands and actually having the ability to really transform the outcome for patients.
Absolutely. So there's kind of two classes of surgeons that are most sort of intimately involved with the tech that we're developing. So there's functional neurosurgeons, and those are the ones who are implanting the traditional DBS devices today. And when we talk to them, their big response is today's DBS devices, there are certain targets in the brain that are hard for them to reach and hard to get there accurately. And yeah, they have to avoid vessels, that's the big challenge for them. But if we can get there with a blood vessel, that makes it a lot easier. And then the other class of surgeons are the endovascular neurosurgeons. So the ones that are traditionally navigating catheters to the brain. And those are the folks who are today treating strokes and aneurysms. Those surgeons today, their caseloads tend to be very responsive to emergencies, and they don't have a lot of elective cases. And so they're very, very excited about the prospect of being able to have elective cases where they can deliver a real therapy that'll help patients rather than just being on call to treat patients who come in with stroke in an emergency setting all the time. So they are tremendously excited about the potential to have a new tech that can allow them to deliver better outcomes for these patients. There's a huge frustration in the field of stroke right now where, a patient has a stroke, they go home. If they have motor deficits, about 50% of stroke survivors have some form of long-term disability. And we really don't have great options for them right now. They have to do physical therapy and occupational therapy, which works to a certain extent, and then they tend to plateau. And so, I don't think we actually talked about this yet, but what we're focusing on specifically is DBS for stroke rehab, to enhance these outcomes for these stroke patients. And yeah, clinicians are really excited and very much recognizing the need for better therapies for these patients because there's just not a lot out there that works well for them today.
And what about for you personally? Because you've been doing all this research for such a long time in this technology. What was that moment that made you think, wow, this is the right time to take this to market?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm coming from the academic world, have been developing new neuro devices for about 10 years now through PhD and postdoc. But, I got a little tired of just kind of developing a new tech, writing an interesting paper in a journal article and not seeing it actually have real world impact. So in terms of that moment, honestly, I joined this lab at MIT, Polina Anakiva's lab, as a postdoc. That's the lab that we're spinning the technology out from for NeuroBionics. And I met another postdoc in the lab at the time, whose name was MJ Antonini. He had done his PhD in that lab, and he had been working on the fiber tech for about 8 or 9 years at the time that I met him. And he told me right from the start, I joined the lab, and he's like, I am going to take this technology and build a medical device with it because I want to see it have real world impact. And there's some backstory in that I had also thought about entrepreneurship and starting a company previously. So when he told me that, I was like, great, I think we really have something here. Like, this is a really, really interesting, unique technology that has tremendous potential. So it was a pretty natural partnership that built, and then we ended up spinning out NeuroBionics about 2 years after I joined the lab and met MJ and started talking about it.
That's so awesome. And yeah, I was thinking back, I met the peer review probably a year ago, and you are just awesome people and, a fantastic duo working alongside one another. And I think that has to be, Cal, because this is obviously going to be a long journey when you're navigating the regulatory requirements for doing something like this.
That's right, Richard. Yeah, and it was something, Nicky, that we're super curious about. And now, granted, NeuroBionics, you might still be in these early development stages, but you're working towards an actual product and technology to help folks with a specific type of challenge. So that regulatory path, I guess, today, kind of, what does that look like? I mean, we would imagine there'd be a number of animal studies, and then clinical trials. So the road could be long, but is there a 510K? Is this PMA because of just how unique it is? I mean, what does that look like?
Yeah, so our regulatory pathway is likely class 3 PMA. So we are following the pre-market approval route in terms of what that pathway looks like for us. So right now, the plan is really the next 2 years or so, really digging into all of the biocompatibility and safety studies. So we're doing some studies in animals showing that we can safely deploy our device into the target blood vessel, that it doesn't occlude blood flow, that it doesn't cause thrombosis or clotting. That's a super important thing for any device that's going to be left in a blood vessel. So a lot of safety and biocompatibility testing that we're focusing on in animals right now. And then essentially the pathway for PMA is then you apply for an IDE or investigational device exemption, and then do your early feasibility studies in humans, followed by a pivotal trial. So there is a chance we may be able to do a more limited demonstration under an IRB before we get the IDE approval, but and we have a couple of clinical partners who are interested in that, and we're just trying to kind of flesh out what that might look like. But for us, yeah, it's about 2 years or so of pretty intense safety and biocompatibility testing in animals.
Sure, no doubt. And it sounds like while you're focusing in one particular area, I think you might have even been alluding to the fact that there could be an opportunity to help treat various parts of the body and a number of different types of conditions. Um, could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've talked a lot about DBS, deep brain stimulation, and initially we're focusing on stroke rehabilitation. So there's a very specific target in the brain, in the cerebellum, that's part of the circuit that connects your cerebellum to your motor cortex. And there's a lot of evidence showing that if you stimulate that area, you can help patients recover more motor function after stroke. So that's what we're focusing on first. But DBS itself can be used for a lot of different conditions, including Parkinson's disease, tremor, epilepsy, trials for depression, and Alzheimer's disease, as I talked about earlier. And those are just different targets, different regions in the brain. We're really developing a platform for minimally invasive stimulation. So we can use almost the same device, just go to a slightly different target inside the brain to treat these different conditions. And that's kind of step one, is let's develop this device as a minimally invasive DBS platform. But we really have ambitions to go beyond that, because there's a lot of, we talked earlier about bioelectronic medicine. There are targets in the peripheral nervous system that are tremendously useful for treating patients with various forms of chronic pain and also incontinence. And there's a lot of precedent for using these peripheral nerve stimulation technologies. We can do something very similar with our device. Next to most major nerves in the body, there is a blood vessel, because those nerves are nourished by those blood vessels. So our vision really is like, let's take this tech and make it a platform for minimally invasive neurostimulation that can be used really across the body, because your blood vessels go everywhere. And that's an ability for us to get to these sometimes hard to reach targets through a less invasive method and deliver stimulation. So really, we're kind of looking at this as a broader platform.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, Richard, we've been hearing this trend with a few types of medical technologies that have come on the show, and they're talking about developing this platform and having almost that toolkit or that toolbox to be able to serve, various treatments and different parts of the, say, the body. Now, this is all brain focused. But I just think how you can treat, start with stroke, but then, how can you, go on to treat essential tremor, Parkinson's, incontinence. It's a remarkable, and all, major health problems that are constantly looking for innovation. But all of this, I mean, geez, Nicky, you've got your hands full. I mean, this is some of the more complex technology, I think, Richard, that we've had on our show. So it's probably not going to be rainbows and butterflies, Richard, right? I mean, this
Well, the word challenging comes to mind. I mean, I'm thinking
yeah,
that
no kidding.
For
it's
sure,
like, wow.
yeah. Yeah,
You
we've
know,
got a long
honestly.
road ahead of us, and we have folks being like, okay, so you're developing a stimulation device that's also going in a blood vessel. Like, oh, your reg requirements and your safety testing are going to be a bear. So yes, it's definitely going to be a long road. There's a lot of work ahead of us, but we're so excited with the potential that it could have.
So how did you? Because you think about like making decisions, working in the peripheral system as a sort of beachhead might seem that less risky, less costly pathway to get there. So when you were thinking about which path to go down, what kind of ultimately was the decision maker that led you down that chosen way?
Yeah, we had a lot of conversation with clinicians. That was really how we started in trying to narrow down on potential market segments where we wanted to start. There were a lot of different factors that went into it, really assessing the needs, what else is already out there on the market. And what the reason that we focused on brain first and doing DBS as opposed to focusing on a peripheral target initially. There's a couple of reasons, and one of the biggest ones is those areas. We have a really strong value proposition there because today craniotomy, open brain surgery versus minimally invasive. In the peripheral nervous system, there's a lot of players, so there's a lot of companies that are already building really awesome nerve stimulating devices, and while they do require pretty invasive cut down procedures, right, like open surgical approaches. There are already things that work reasonably well that are not so outrageously invasive that patients aren't getting them. So we really were kind of looking at where is there a niche small market where we would have a huge value proposition. allow us to kind of prove out the tech in that market first and then expand from there. So there were a lot of factors that went into that decision making, but at the end of the day, we just felt like we had the strongest value proposition for minimally invasive DBS.
And again, doing such a robust or risky pathway is going to cost a lot of money. And so did you have a conversation with investors, when you're actually looking at what that journey looks like? If you had any feedback where they go, yeah, we see this opportunity as well, and this is something we would invest in?
Yeah, we have. So we're actually like pretty darn close to closing a pre-seed round of funding. We've talked to a lot of investors over the last year, and we get a lot of different perspectives. We talked earlier about how we're kind of thinking about this as a platform technology, and we get one of two types of responses to that. We get the investors who say, oh, well, if you're a platform, you're not focused enough. You're going to need too much money to get this to market. It's going to take too long. Or you get investors who are really bought into the big vision of how big that could be, who love that approach. And we've also seen kind of a dichotomy of those between East Coast and West Coast investors. So West Coast investors tend to be more excited about the big vision platform play than East Coast investors, which is interesting. But yes, we've had a lot of conversation with investors, and we do know we have a long road to market, and it is definitely going to be capital intensive. And we've had the most luck in really connecting with investors that can get behind a big vision like that, and also are not the type of investors that are necessarily like, I must get a return on investment within 7 years, because that's really hard to do in the med device industry.
Oh yeah, but that's great to hear that you've got like those positive conversations happening, Kyle, and clearly we like to hear the big vision and the big impact that can be created through these types of technologies.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah. And Richard, I was, thinking as Nicky was chatting about that near term, long term vision, something that we're always super curious about is that kind of next 6 to 18 months, you guys are going to be grinding it out. What are some, milestones that you're looking to achieve, let's just say in those next 6 to 18 months?
Yeah, so we're pretty close to running a pilot in animals where we're testing safety of deploying our device in a vessel, and then efficacy, so showing that we can stimulate brain tissue from this approach. So while early on, that's a big milestone for us. And then going beyond that, we do plan to apply for a breakthrough device designation with the FDA. If we can get it, that would be a huge milestone that gives you sort of a privileged access and privileged relationship with the FDA, and possibly can also help with reimbursement. So that, can't mark that off as a definite, but we do plan to apply for that sometime next year. And if we're able to get it, that would be a huge milestone. Going further, then we're going to be starting some chronic studies in animals. So not only acutely implanting and showing that we can stimulate, but leaving our device in there for about 6 months and showing that it's safe. It can stimulate long-term over that time period. So that'll be another big milestone. And then finally, that IDE submission, that's obviously the big milestone at the end of this kind of preclinical period.
And the funding, you were commenting on funding too. Would that be something that you're trying to obviously achieve in that next
Yes.
6 to 18 months?
Yeah, sorry. Yes. Yeah. So we're raising a pre-seed round right now, very close to closing. That'll give us about 2 years of runway. And our goal is that funding period will get us through to IDE submission essentially, and set us up well to start our first in-human trials. And we've also been applying for non-dilutive funding, so applying for grants. Still waiting on getting some scores back from those, but doing what we can to bring the funding in to make it happen.
And so when the money comes in, which I'm sure it will be, you've got your co-founder, you mentioned you've got your advisor, Polina and Akiva. Who else in the team are you thinking about adding on? Are you going to be outsourcing, or what's your kind of approach to that maybe next key employee?
Yeah, so we have 2 full-time employees besides MJ and myself right now, both engineers, both really excellent, one of whom we poached from Boston Scientific, who was working in endovascular pulse field ablation systems. So she brought like really excellent relevant background. We've been working with some kind of part-time consultant type folks for regulatory and quality systems. And next big hire for us will be more of a experienced industry medtech person to be kind of director of product. And so there's certain roles like that we're keeping in-house and hiring for. And then other things that we are outsourcing and or working with partners, such as, I talk about the pulse generator, the electronics unit. We're going to work with an external partner for that, but definitely looking to grow the team a little bit over the next year or two. But right now we are 4 full-time, and we also have a co-op student and a summer intern. So team of 6 right now for NeuroBionics.
It's funny, Nicky, hearing you talk, I feel like you've done all this before because it seems to come very naturally to you. So yeah, you're the consummate professional. You just take everything in your stride, which I think is part of being a great entrepreneur.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely learning on the fly here. But it's been really fun, kind of jumping headfirst into the world of entrepreneurship. Has been a really awesome experience.
Yeah, I would agree with Richard with those comments, Nikki. I mean, you are just absolutely incredible. Can you maybe do a little reflection for us, right? So NeuroBionics, MIT spinout, developing something that, really doesn't exist today, something truly innovative and something very complex, throughout this journey, what are maybe a couple pieces of advice that you might be able to share with folks that might be following in a similar path as you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, as you say, we're an MIT spinout, and I will not detract from how fortunate we've been to be a spinout from MIT. We have benefited so much from the ecosystem of entrepreneurship surrounding MIT and surrounding Boston. And so if I were to offer a piece of advice to someone who's just getting into entrepreneurship, one of the biggest things that I've learned and have benefited from tremendously is just not being afraid to ask for help. There's so much to learn. There's so many things that you don't know going into this. And what I've really, really loved about diving into entrepreneurship is just an incredible network of people who are just willing to lend their advice. So finding founders that are a year or two ahead of us who have gone through these challenges before and are willing to just jump on the phone and lend an ear, lend their perspective, lend advice. So I've absolutely loved that about entrepreneurship, and it's really been such a good ecosystem of people that are willing to be mentors and advisors. And so we have benefited so much from that. And I think that sometimes folks are not necessarily wanting to always be willing to ask questions all the time. And that's really important to kind of put your pride behind you and just say I'm not the best person or most well qualified person to handle this one aspect. Who can I ask for help? And so we've really benefited from that approach and finding a lot of people who are willing to be mentors and advisors to us. And that's been really instrumental in the journey.
And what motivates you every day, Nikki?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I really want to see bring a technology to market that's going to have impact on patients. I talked earlier, I'm coming from the academic world. I love building new technologies. I've been doing that for about 10 years now, and I really got tired of publishing academic papers and not seeing that actually have real world impact. So what I'm really, really excited about is taking this new tech that we developed and actually seeing it have impact on patients and improving outcomes. And so that's really the North Star and the goal is really keeping that vision in mind.
Well, Richard, speaking of vision, huh?
Yeah, totally. I mean, honestly, I'm thinking again back to your co-founder, MJ, and clearly you guys are on the same page. You've sat down, you've got a shared vision. What is that? Because you're going to be on a long journey again. So you must have sat down and gone, this is where we want to be in 10 years' time, 15 years' time.
Yeah, we did. And this also goes back to I've been so fortunate to start this company with MJ, right? He was the perfect person to be my co-founder. We've got a great working relationship, and he's hyper organized and also really cares about making sure that we've got the vision and the priorities set down. So before we even incorporated a little over a year ago, when we decided hey, we're probably going to do this, we sat down and went through the very in-depth exercise together of what's our vision? What are our priorities? What do we most care about? How do we work well? How do we like communication? And just kind of fleshing that all out together to make sure that we were on the same page and knew what was important to each of us. and made sure that we had a shared vision and a shared set of priorities. So we did go through a pretty involved exercise in that before we ultimately incorporated NeuroBionics. And I think that's has been really good, and is something that really anyone who's thinking about starting a company with a co-founder, that's an exercise that you should go through and really make sure that you're on the same page. We've gone through a couple of startup accelerators, and we hear a lot of horror stories of like when teams fall apart. A lot of times it is co-founders not being on the same page. And we've been really fortunate that we've got really good communication, and we're really clear about that from the start. But definitely something really important to make sure that you go through that exercise and really talk about those big things from the beginning.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. So that's great advice. Asking questions, setting that vision with your co-founder. But again, like what did that ultimately look like? So you've sat down, you're both on the same page, and do you see this being something that you're setting to build a big company, to be acquired? What was that kind of like final outcome of where you want to be?
Yeah, I think our goal is to have impact, like clinical impact. And the way that we think about the longer term vision for the company is to build towards assuming that we are going to build the company to be the one delivering this tech to market. Now, granted, in our space, the most common exit is acquisition if you're lucky, if you're successful. And so that is definitely a possible outcome for us. But it would probably be in the later stages, just given the type of tech that we're building. Companies that are building neuromodulation devices, if they do get acquired, tend to be after they're maybe have received their PMA approval and are kind of gearing up for market access. Right now, the goal is build the company as if we're going to take this thing all the way. And if there's an opportunity for acquisition along the way, that doesn't compromise the vision that we have, and make sure that this tech actually gets into the hands of clinicians and patients, that would be a great outcome. But really, we're just building with the assumption that we're gonna take this all the way.
Well, Nicky, as you build and as you go through this journey, many folks are going to want to get in touch with you. You might want to get in touch with people. People might want to just simply follow along with NeuroBionics to watch your progress. What's the best way to kind of get in touch with you or NeuroBionics and follow the story, the mission, the journey that you guys are on?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say for following the company and seeing our progress, LinkedIn is the best way. Follow NeuroBionics on LinkedIn. For folks who are really interested, they can also reach out to us. So we've got a website, neurobionics.io. There's a contact page there where you can find our kind of general email, team@neurobionics.io. If anyone's super hyper interested, they can email us and we can put you on our quarterly newsletter, which we send out to some of our close advisors and mentors, and also folks who are just really interested in following our progress. So for anyone who's interested in that, feel free to reach out. We're happy to add you to the newsletter. But beyond that, LinkedIn's a good place. We're posting our updates as we go.
Awesome, Nicky. Well, you're super active. And that's gonna pay dividends, I think, for everyone that wants to follow along. So thanks for being such a great leader and sharing your story with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I always love talking about the vision, and it's great to be on the MedTech Impact podcast.
Well, I know we're going to be following you, and everyone listening in, I'm sure will be as well. So again, just thank you so much for coming on and sharing the vision and sharing the mission, and yeah, just giving a little bit more insight into what lies ahead for the future of DBS.
Absolutely.
Awesome, guys. Well, another huge thank you to Nicky Driscoll, founder and chief technology officer at NeuroBionics. And thank you for tuning in for another episode of the MedTech Impact Podcast. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Meiklejohn. Until next time, keep innovating.